Close worrying
Hello,
about it.
Vinay.
I get it
Today our
wrong
guest is
enough
Vinay
times. So
Kolhatkar. Hello,
uh,
Vinay. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How is it out there in Chicago?
Oh, I'm not in Chicago, Vinay. I'm in Jamaica.
Oh, even
Yes,
more
but
wonderful weather.
yes, but foreigners are familiar with Chicago time. It's easier for them. So tonight we'll be discussing some of your articles. Now, Vinay, you are the publisher of a brilliant magazine called Savvy Street. Tell us a little about Savvy Street.
Thank you for the compliment. The Savvy Street is a public intellectual zine. I started that about 7 years ago. And its primary purpose is to make people more savvy, more sly, more aware of the world around them, because I think the mainstream media is trying to portray a world that actually doesn't exist. It's something else. Clever, astute, you can get all the synonyms of savvy, and that's what we're trying to make people, but giving them a intellectual foundation, giving them a intellectual ammunition, if you will, that'll make it a lot easier for them to make their own decisions about life. And, if they are in a conversation, a debate against someone else. So it's not purely political. We also have the art of living, how to lead more productive, flourishing lives as a key ingredient. We also have, science and a discussion of art and aesthetics. So it's a philosophical easing rather than just driven by economics and politics. We have so far, including you, thank you, Lipton. So far, we have about 25 contributors and about 400, give or take, essays. But we're just going into videos and audios like you have.
Yes, and your latest book was actually reviewed by the Mises Institute.
That's correct. More exactly, it was a review for the Journal of Austrian Economics. Now, our book, Media Wars, which I'm the co-author of, so not the sole author of. The other one's an American based in New York, Walter Donway, a former journalist. It's about culture and philosophical foundations of the Enlightenment and how the US and the world and the West got to where it got to, what we can do about it. We have 7 sections, including art and terrorism and sexuality. One of the sections is about economics. So that got reviewed in the Austrian Journal of, the Journal of Austrian Economics, but primary focus of that review was the economics, in which we posit that Keynesianism is not actually economics at all. It's a scam. And they loved that. And they loved in particular the no holds barred language we use, which they said we can't use it in academia.
All right, so I am also a contributor to Mises Institute. And Vinay, I appreciate your publication because it's intellectually astute and that your writers are also interested in illuminating the brilliant ideas of Ayn Rand.
Thank you. Yeah, most of our writers are either former or current objectivists. Now, we don't make that a requirement for our writers. We just want them to love and promote individualism primarily. So some of them are kind of, they call themselves libertarian, if you will. There have been viewpoints expressed which oppose or certainly portray Rand as imperfect. So it's not kind of a Rand magazine, if you will. Most of our authors, though, I met at different objectivist conferences. So they are well versed in objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and that influences their thinking. But what we try to do is, we're not a news magazine. We try to portray everything in terms of principles, principles that are timeless, so that you can look at the same article in 5 years or 10 years time, or even sometimes 15, 20, and it's still current because the ideas are current. They're timeless, right from Aristotle to now. Some ideas remain timeless, some don't.
Vinay, self-esteem is crucial. Ayn Rand said it herself. Man must have self-esteem. And this is the problem with the West today. Westerners lack self-esteem.
So you want me to comment on that? Because
Yes, yes,
I wrote an essay which you may have read called the 10 psychological needs of human beings.
yes, I
And
saw
in
it.
that, I posited self-esteem is one of them rather than the only one. So I do not emphasize it to the same extent that Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden did, but it's crucial to understand that self-esteem as posited by Rand is not, I guess it's not an sort of a glorified sense of self-importance beyond what is necessary. It's yours having the feeling that you have a right to live, that you have a right to be happy, and most importantly, that you are competent, mentally competent to understand reality and make choices about yourself. That is the foundation of self-esteem.
Exactly. But when a man loses his self-esteem, he becomes deracinated, like a depressed dog. And a depressed dog cannot manage anything. And the West today is basically a depressed dog.
A lot is, I guess, a lot more prevalent. I had looked at those numbers a while ago, and it's astonishing because if you look at the medical future of the globe, or the medical past, I'm sorry, of the globe, about 100 years ago, even in countries like South Korea, which is a very advanced nation today, and in India, the average life expectancy was so low, like in India, it was below 30 in the 1920s. In South Korea, my memory may serve me right here, but was in the 30s or something, high 20s or early 30s. 100 years later, it's approximately three times as much in both those countries. So in Asia in particular, and I imagine, I haven't looked at the numbers in South America and Africa, but it could be similar. There have been extraordinary progress in the field of medicine, in the field of reducing infant mortality, and in prosperity and reduction of poverty in general. But that hasn't been accompanied at all by the reduction in depression. Now, maybe there are more people going to psychologists and psychiatrists because that was considered there was stigma around mental illness even 20 years ago, which there isn't now. Some people proudly say, oh, I've got a mental illness now. It's as if become, a medal to attach to your shirt or something. But without question, mental trauma and illness have gone in the other direction to material prosperity, which it shouldn't. But that's what has happened. And I think that probably the case is there is an assault, not probably, we're sure of it. There is an assault on the mind and on its ability to reason, so to, there's an attempt to undercut, which is successful, the confidence of children in education, and to undercut the confidence of adults by weaponizing language and twisting the terms and reducing their understanding. And also there is so much censorship now across mainstream media, social media, so you don't get the truths from all the conventional major media. That makes all of that combination makes it a lot worse for individuals to get through, develop their own thinking capacity, and stand aside from the mob, so to speak. It's becoming more difficult, no doubt.
However, Vinay, we cannot discuss political censorship without referring to the role of right-wing pundits in facilitating censorship. So you're on my show and we're having a discussion, but many of the mainstream pundits, Vinay, they're not interviewing people like yourself or the scholars affiliated to the Mises Institute or those who write for Chronicles magazine.
They're not. And if they are and they say something wrong, they are, and as we know, so many good scholars, so many well-researched people have been brought down on YouTube. They have been disbarred from just speaking peacefully at various forums, including universities. There's a lot of things behind it. Two primary reasons. We've had a growth in what I would call neo-Marxism. And it's been a tremendous amount of growth in academia. I mean, this was an explicit ambition of the more conventional Marxists. Trotsky dreamt of having a Marxist beachhead in the United States back in the 1920s. And they succeeded, although that's Marxism has morphed a little bit into what I'd call neo-Marxism, so that instead of only a class struggle, which is economic in nature, we now have struggles of Black versus white, of races, of ethnicities, of genders, and also of different kinds of sexualities. They basically trying to divide us. But coupled with that, there's a lot of money that is flowing in to fund the likes of Antifa, which ironically calls itself an anti-fascist group, but they in fact engender fascism. And they are violent. They are correctly denoted as a terrorist group by the United States. So when you see, someone like a professor who wants to simply express a view that we should grade students according to their merit, I mean, they disbarred from speaking such an obvious statement that it should have been taken as the norm. And they disbarred violently. And that is a big problem now.
Like Dorian Abbott, who is being assaulted for opposing diversity politics. Students ought to be appointed based on merit, not their skin color, sexual identity, or any other faddish doctrine. And Dorian Abbott was assaulted, but luckily for him, he decided to do the speech online and people signed up. I didn't sign up, but many did.
It's great because I believe this is the savior, if there is going to be any, of civilization, and that is alternate media. And it's strange how alternate media morphs. So at the beginning, YouTube was an alternate media. So if you couldn't get your voice heard on NBC or the BBC or the ABC, then you could go on YouTube and post your own video. Now YouTube is censoring certain kinds of opinion because they've become very big. And it's similar in fascism, like in a Chinese style fascism. If you own a little bread shop on the corner, as my understanding is the government won't bother with you. You're a free entrepreneur if you own a little pharmacy, a small piece of land. But as you get bigger, as you become Huawei or halfway towards Huawei, they entrap you. And that, I think, is similar to what's happening to alternate media. If you're small enough like we are, then we can speak freely and nobody is getting deplatformed. But YouTube is very big now, and the big ones are snared in that sort of corporate socialism, or what Ayn Rand called fascism net. And fascism being the government doesn't control or own completely the media or the organization or the business, but they effectively control it through a variety of regulations, pressures, laws. They interfere so much behind the scenes, sometimes overtly, explicitly, ahead of the scene, ahead of the curtain, if you will, that it becomes impossible to run a free-flowing business. I mean, there's a lot of legislation already, hate speech legislation that's prevalent in Europe. And the United States is protected by its First Amendment. But the hate speech affects YouTube and Facebook and other social media in a lot of European jurisdictions as well as over the world. And they are a major international organization. Their revenue doesn't come just from the United States. So they have to bow to that pressure because their purpose is to make profits for their shareholders. And that doesn't mean that the owners there are necessarily innocent and simply being pressured either. There is a sort of a nefarious, incestuous nest created because sometimes it's big corporations that invoke and elicit regulation so that the competition is reduced. Now, if you take a big bank and a small bank, how does regulation hurt the small bank? It's kind of a fixed cost, and a large JP Morgan Chase bank can wear that fixed cost. It's a little cost. The small bank can't wear that fixed cost easily at all. It's as a proportion of its revenue, it's too large, it goes out of business. So JP Morgan would rather have these kinds of regulations. So they invite regulation seemingly against them, but in fact it is to reduce competition. They make large scale donations. I mean, big pharma has been recorded as making billions of dollars of donations just in the United States political sphere, and we're not even talking globally. I linked that research to in one of the vaccine mandate essay, or the moral case against vaccine passports. And it's done quite adroitly. It's not all going into a Biden versus Trump campaign where it is much more visible, much more investigated. It's going into a lot of local congressional primaries where it's not investigated to the same extent. So they're buying influence because they want to aggrandize their own wealth, power, security. They want to entrench themselves. So this kind of mercantilism, corporate socialism, or fascism, you can use different terms. The nefarious, incestuous government corporate relationships are old as history, but they are becoming enormously strong, and both parties, the large corporates and the government, are guilty. But we are caught in the middle, and liberties are being eroded away, unfortunately.
We are noticing the rise of woke capital. Walmart, Coca-Cola, and other institutions are now indoctrinating employees into thinking that whiteness is problematic. So the corporations, as I said in a private correspondence with an academic, they're basically the children of the managerial state.
Certainly, the corporation is now being driven by what is being called stakeholder capitalism. And all major corporations are falling for it because the pressure is just too much. The money flowing in is a lot, and the pressures from media, from government are excessive, and they're yielding to it. So firstly, let's talk about minorities and racism. We both come from, you and I, Lipton and I, both come from, minorities, and we have different experiences about what it means to be a minority in a Western nation. But as Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority is the individual. And so therefore grouping is a form of racism. If you have quotas for universities, X amount of quotas for Latinos or Asians or Blacks or Jews, that's outright racism. And the same goes for corporations. So, if you're born white, well, that's just, it wasn't your choice. It was just an accident of nature, and it's not an accident. It's nice to be white. It's nice to be black. It's nice to be, something in between like I am. It doesn't matter. And so any ideology that pushes whiteness or male or anything like that as being problematic simply because 5 generations ago some whites did some things to some blacks is hugely problematic because the child, as we say, is not responsible for the sins of thy father. And certainly the child is not responsible for what happened 5 or 6 generations ago. And even that history is being re-recorded. So we have a huge problem. But at the same time, there is this concept called stakeholder capitalism. And that I would term I'm going to use an Ayn Rand term. She used the term anti, or what you might call anti-concept. And an anti-concept is a concept that isn't valid, and it's introduced deliberately to weaponize language and to obfuscate, to nullify what an existing valid concept is. And capitalism is a valid concept. It means in a pure capitalism, the government cannot interfere at all in the workings of the economy. So there would be no central bank, there would be no regulation as such. The laws would look after people. So you can certainly have class actions against corporations that have sinned. You can certainly have one corporation going up against the other because they polluted their land and so on and so forth. So illegal activities are not tolerated as long as the law is against force, fraud, and deception. And so the corporation as an entity is susceptible and answerable to the law like any other individual is, like the corporate as a legal entity is already the case. And that's capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is being contrasted with shareholder capitalism, and both concepts are invalid because capitalism is simply capitalism. And shareholders, by the very word suggests, they own shares, like, they together in aggregate, the shareholders own the corporation. So let's posit you own a car and someone forces you to lend out that car one day a week to some other person who doesn't have a car. I mean, that's force, and that's immoral. It should be illegal, even if they compensated you for it. It's entirely up to you if you let your cousin drive around for a week or a day or whatever. But it's your car. So the shareholders own the corporation. It's already subject to laws, and it's their corporation. So there are no other stakeholders that can dictate to the shareholders. Now, it makes a lot of economic sense for shareholders to think long term, and they do. There's a lot of evidence that the market thinks long term anyway. And if you're thinking long term, it's in your interest. It's in the shareholders' interest to look after their employees reasonably well, to have good working conditions so that there isn't a huge turnover. Obviously, they have to look after their customers. If they're unhappy customers, your revenues are going to dwindle. They obviously have to look after those who have a stake in the corporation as suppliers, for instance. And so it looks after itself, if you will. There's no need for a separate stakeholder capitalism kind of thing. And shareholder capitalism is invalid because shareholders own corporations, end of story. There are alternate theories like Professor Bainbridge, director primacy, as if the directors own the corporation. There was McKee, I think, John McKee of Whole Foods, who countered Milton Friedman's view that shareholders own corporation. As a matter of fact, and as a matter of law, they do, by saying he hired the investors. And that is wrong as well, because the investors always hire him. And it doesn't mean Friedman was misinterpreted as having said that means even top executives are the servants. The word used in the New York Times was servants of the shareholders. He didn't say that. Friedman didn't say that. And that's wrong, because we have, or we ought to have, free contracting. The US Constitution, if I'm not mistaken, Section 10 of Article 1 says the government shall not in any form get in the way of voluntary contracting. So before a corporation is put together, there's voluntary contracting, and there is a deed that governs the shareholders. So if you're a potential CEO looking for a job, you negotiate contractually as a free person your terms, and then you have to abide by those terms. Otherwise, there is a breach of contract. The same goes for every employee. Same goes for even customers. There are implied contracts at law when you sell something. And in that situation, nobody is the master, nobody is the servant. And it doesn't matter who approached whom first. You know, if you are my neighbor, I've got an old lawnmower to sell. I could approach you and say, do you want it for $100? You might say, no, it doesn't look so good, but I'll have it for 50. Good, trade is done. $50 for the mower. You get it. I get 50. We're both happy. And you're not my servant, you're not my master. It's a relationship of equals. And what free contracting does is it introduces essentially a relationship of equals because of competition, even among, let us say, the CEO and the cleaning company. If the cleaning company has alternate places it could go to and doesn't have to accept conditions that they don't want to accept. So, you know, it's a long way of saying stakeholder capitalism is an invalid term, and it has been brought in to introduce more fascism. And the primary culprit behind that is the World Economic Forum.
Yes, the World Economic Forum, Davos. Vinay, there's an article published by the Harvard Business Review titled The EU's Unsustainable Approach to Stakeholder Capitalism. And this article essentially is arguing that stakeholder capitalism will lead to policy inertia. And I agree. Stakeholders, Vinay, are literally people who claim to have an interest. If you want an interest in a company, go and buy shares. It's really a meaningless concept. Anyone under these regulations can be considered to be a stakeholder. But when one is running a company, we require accountability. And the CEO cannot be accountable to trite sentiments.
Absolutely. I mean, in practical terms, it becomes impossible. I mean, who's a stakeholder? Virtually every citizen of the world can be a stakeholder in a large organization like large international organization like, say, Facebook. If every customer of, you know, AT&T or Huawei is a stakeholder and they have a say, a real say in the decision making, you could have a board of directors of 7,000 people that the CEO is answerable to. And quite obviously that would become unworkable, but it's, to start with, it's invalid in the first place. So they're right about if you actually implement it in a pure sense, it would be impractical, but that's not what the World Economic Forum is about. They want to introduce that concept to make corporations feel guilty about not doing the right thing by the environment, about, you know, employing certain labor at certain rates in third world countries and so on and so forth. They want to introduce guilt in the place of law and regulation, and then eventually supplement it with law and regulation.
The environment. Vinay, I have interviewed a number of scientists on this show, and during these interviews, we assess climate change in depth. The climate, Vinay, is always changing. With or without us, the climate will change, and the effects of climate change are not uniform. Climate change can either be a positive development or a negative development. It is not a problem that we can truly avert.
I agree with that. I mean, I go back to the sense of scientific methodology. I think it was the Club of Rome in 1960, or it could have been a little bit after that, that posited there is, well, the Club of Rome posited that resources are limited, and the
Their,
neo-Marxists loved it. But
their, their
yeah, go on.
predictions failed. This is what I discussed with my guests. The predictions of the eco-pessimists, they failed. And if we go back centuries to people in the medieval ages, they were also unsuccessful.
Absolutely. And
Like
this
Giovanni
whole,
Botero, they failed.
yeah, the climate hypothesis, I believe, came somewhere around the 70s, and it
Yes,
was retracted by the
by the
first person.
professor,
Yeah,
the,
but it
the
was,
man who taught Al Gore, he retracted.
yeah, exactly. Now, let's look at it scientifically. If you posit, you or anyone else suddenly goes around positing that the moon is made of cheese, the onus is on you to show the evidence, prove it, or at least get that whole hypothesis to a standard of a reasonable theory. And that never happened with this whole hypothesis that of anthropogenic global warming. But what actually happened was the states, by that I mean the nation states across the world, grabbed it as an opportunity to expand their power over corporations. So we now find somewhere around 80 to 90% of research on climate change is funded by governments. They want a certain kind of conclusion to come through the so-called peer-reviewed journals. And that's what comes through, because if it doesn't, then that person suffers. Initially ostracization, maybe loss of job, loss of career. And on the other hand, there are lucrative government contracts, more fame, more power, more money, if you comply with the narrative. Surprise, surprise, follow the money, and 20, 30 years later, you get claims that so-called 97% of the scientists agree, which itself
That's
is also
incorrect. The
untrue.
Cook's,
Yeah,
yes.
that's
And
untrue. Exactly. That's untrue.
let me
But
remind our
yeah,
viewers of the Cook study. The Cook study said over 97% of scientists with an opinion on anthropogenic global warming agree that humans are the cause of climate change, but over 60% of the scientists, they express no remark. That's the finding of the Cook study.
right. So somehow the 97 plus 60 isn't adding up to 100.
No, yeah, it's basically a bunch of hogwash. So for instance, we're often told that polar bears are suffering. Not according to Crockford, polar bears are doing quite well, and she's an actual scientist.
And look, even if the 97% number was, let us say it was 47 or 67, science is not, firstly, it's not decided by the majority opinion. So Galileo wasn't in the majority. And a lot of other remarkable theories were not, certainly not in the majority at the beginning, but it's decided by logic and evidence. But secondly, as I said, the onus is on those positing a wild hypothesis, which this is. Thirdly, because of all the pressures and the money, even if that number instead of 97% was say 67, most of the 67 would change their tune very quickly. If the money changed, if the money was withdrawn, they would suddenly, and if they didn't face any ostracization, if there was no career benefit in pushing that establishment narrative, that number would go down to close to zero, the 97%,
And
which is fake.
do you know what's really fascinating, Vinay? Many of the men and women who are blackballed as climate deniers, they became skeptical of anthropogenic climate change when they were quite old. So they didn't have an incentive to earn money. They
Yeah.
became skeptics well over 40, many of them.
Yeah, I find that very disturbing also that it's happening to heads of state. Now, here in Australia, we had a prime minister, Tony Abbott, who went along with the establishment narrative. As a conservative party, they tried to oppose it to some degree. But in interviews like Donald Trump and others, he would always say, yeah, no, I agree with the science without elaborating what the actual and real science is. Supposedly, privately within his cabinet, he called it bullshit, but he wasn't prepared to say it publicly. Publicly, he supported a renewable energy scheme and simply tried to do what he could in terms of, holding back the money that went into it. Now that he's out of politics, he's getting money in the UK to advocate that it is a scam, which it is. But I find that very disturbing. The so-called strongmen, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi, Donald Trump, none of them ever looked at the whole thing in its face and said to their citizens and to the media that we believe this is a scam, it's fraud, and taxpayer funding of this fraud must stop now and immediately. They did what they could behind the scenes, but that simply isn't enough. In my opinion, we now need heads of state who confront this whole scam head on. But I'm afraid we're not going to get it because we have this, as we spoke about, the nested, nefarious, incestuous corporate state, if you will.
So
And yeah, go on.
back to Donald Trump. During the Trump tenure, many institutions on the political right actually elaborated quite sophisticated arguments against the Paris Treaty, but none of these arguments were employed by Trump to sway the electorate. Trump, like most politicians, are hypocritical and unserious. We're no longer living in the age of convicted politicians like Lee Kuan Yew and Margaret Thatcher. So even though Trump was critical of the Paris Treaty, at no point did he enunciate an actual argument, and as a result, he was blackballed by the media as an ignorant man.
I agree. I agree. This is why I say always, even, I mean, even to my understanding, even Vladimir Putin hasn't. The Chinese premier, I don't think he has. Now they play games. They try to do less than what is actually required while signing up to the Paris Accord, and then making fuzzy plans. But they're caving in, and this is not the way this can be fought. It has to be confronted head on, not by caving in, by doing lip service, and then just doing less than what is required, because that gets them criticized anyway.
And the economic case for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is unclear, and this is an official opinion coming from mainstream academics. Robert Murphy of the Mises Institute, he wrote an excellent article on the piece, and he quoted many of these academics. So the evidence is actually on the side of the climate realist.
I Yeah, I haven't read that piece, but I would say, why do we even need to change? Do we even have the capacity, we as humans, to change that temperature? I mean, there are certain benefits to a warming climate as well. So the first question is, why bother trying to change it?
Yeah, I already discussed these points in previous interviews. Based on how we perceive CO2, it's a bit inaccurate to describe it as a pollutant. Remember, warming is correlated with economic progress, and more people die during cold and environments. So, and even if some diseases are associated with warming, this is only an indirect benefit, an indirect disadvantage of CO2. But broadly understood, CO2 should not be considered as a pollutant.
I agree entirely with that as well. I mean, I think malaria, for instance, the incidence is a lot lower when the weather warms. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I've read
Yeah.
that somewhere. So the case for even trying to adjust the temperature, even if that is feasible, is simply not there.
Vinay, Ayn Rand and the notion of the anti-concept. I watched a YouTube video featuring Ayn Rand some years ago, and she was just awesome. The biggest anti-concept is the notion of the extremist. An idea is either a fundamentalist idea or a syncretic idea. An extremist idea, this is really a misnomer, because if you're saying an idea is extreme, what are you comparing the idea to? It makes no sense. The fundamental idea is the original idea. So when you blackball someone by saying that he's extreme, you're actually arguing that he's consistent with the basic principles of the philosophy. So he's not an extremist.
I agree. I mean, she uses in that discussion, to my memory, she uses the concept of honesty and integrity. What about if you're extremely honest? Do you want an employee who is extremely honest or has extreme integrity? Is he an extremist that everyone should, in fact, be, lying a little bit now and then? So that concept, among so many others, invalid. Extreme is not an invalid word in the English language. Extremist is meaningless. It's again a deliberate ploy, a surreptitious ploy to cloud the debate of what isn't correct.
Yes,
No
and
doubt
then
about it. I mean,
Vinay, I want to talk a little bit about controlled opposition. So recently I was looking, I wouldn't say read it. I barely saw the article. It was published by Salon or maybe the Daily Beast. Maybe it was the Salon publication, and it was a feature on Tim Pool. And Tim Pool was portrayed as this right wing grifter. But when mainstream media outlets write long pieces on Tim Pool, they're doing this to malign serious people on the right, because Tim Pool does not have a coherent philosophy. He's more of an entertainer. His role is to drum up the base. He's not an intellectual in the movement. So when you present a piece on Tim Pool to malign the right, that is irresponsible, because he's not representative of most right-wing intellectuals.
That happens quite often, actually. I mean, even if there was an individual who was an intellectual, could have made one or two mistakes here
Yeah.
and there in their personal life. You cannot extrapolate from that. I mean, my belief is, I saw a documentary on this, that Albert Einstein had affairs. He treated his first wife very badly. What does that say about his theory of relativity?
Nothing
And the
at
answer
all.
is nothing at all. Like, we can judge him badly as a person if we want to. If we believe that story, then that's it. So that kind of malignment, if you will, has been going on for a while. It's gotten a lot worse,
But
particularly with
many,
this.
hold on, Vinny, but many of the people who are promoted by the mainstream media as right-wing intellectuals are not intellectuals or even leaders in the movement. They're just YouTubers.
Yeah, I agree. There's a new sort of, I mean, the Austrians, for instance, Murray Rothbard had posited that, you know, Milton Friedman was put up at the right extreme as the apostle of capitalism, which he wasn't, because he was in favor of having a central bank. He closed the gold window. So, he was nowhere near uh, the extreme right of economics, or he didn't represent the Austrian school. So by positing someone else there, they have this fiction that this is your extreme and you got to be left of that. And otherwise, you're called a conspiracy theorist, which is another term that's being flung around. Its original meaning, it's still in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is simply a theory of a conspiracy. Now, not necessarily does that means the range of theories from the mildly plausible to absurd to very likely, all of that fits in that. And that doesn't make you a wacko, because you're just positing a theory of a conspiracy. The reason is there are too many floating dots out there in the data. There's something massively going wrong in so many places, from the election to the vaccination drive to the treatments being suppressed, to a whole raft of things, to climate change, as you mentioned, that rational thinking individuals have no choice but to come up with a theory that makes sense. And yes, that is a conspiracy theory. And I think we all end up with a theory that assumes a presence of what we call a deep state, that men or women behind the scenes or pulling strings are having enormous power, and that is not explicitly talked about in the media.
But that's not a conspiracy. The deep state is a metaphor for corrupt politicians. That's not a conspiracy.
No, the deep state exists, but to the extent of its power and its influence, I believe it's growing a lot. And we spoke about the nefarious incestuousness. Uh, but if you posit a deep state, if you posit something, you're called a conspiracy theorist, and it's not the label now is flung around like it was an insult, like you're a bit wacko, like you don't follow logic and science, which is the domain of the great, the Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They're the only ones who
No,
have the link to reality.
they're promoting the real fake news. Just recently, Samuel Bowles and his co-author. Well, I can't remember her name. She's a German academic. She's the lead author. He's the second author. But Samuel is a famous economist. And they both contend that people learn by conforming. Therefore, if your friend accept the vaccine, you're likely to become vaccinated. However, when the vaccine is imposed, this will result in trust being diminished, and as such, people are unlikely to accept the vaccine. Hence, if we want the vaccine to become the norm, don't impose a mandate. Allow people to socialize and promote the vaccine to their friends. And I agree with them to an extent. People learn by conforming and they like to follow social trends. And when you force policies on people, they become skeptical of said policy.
I agree. They missed the boat there already. I mean, the force and the pressure and the mandates are all international now in most countries. In fact, you know how you've heard of this term, obviously you researched it, the index of economic freedom, which
Yes.
you, I sort of coined a term last week called the index of medical freedom. And on that scale, I would not be surprised if, you know, I haven't done the research, but if somebody did it, that the Western countries, United Kingdom, the United States in particular, Australia, and almost certainly I've started calling Australia authoritarian, would be at the absolute bottom of the scale because we used to
Sorry,
have,
Vinay, sorry, maybe
yeah,
Canada would be an exception. Maybe Canada, but
perhaps,
not
I
the other
don't know, yeah,
countries. Yeah.
certainly not a lot of Europe would be, and the third world countries, to my knowledge, in South America and Asia, have maintained a level of medical freedom in many of their states, even if it's a federation of states. So what happens is you go to a doctor and he's allowed to treat you for COVID instead of being the subject of a state treatment. He's allowed to prescribe, if he thinks it's what you need, ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or methylene blue, all those treatments that are being ignored. You know, it's between you and your doctor. You have the relationship with your physician. That's not what the case is now in the West. They're being so tightly controlled and so tightly regulated that they're afraid of losing their jobs if they do an off-label prescription. So we have a situation where, you know, the medical freedom is at its lowest it has ever been in the West. I mean, maybe Canada is an exception.
There was a study arguing that ivermectin is linked to fewer cases, but apparently it was retracted and Nature reported on the retraction. However, ivermectin is a respectable product and it can be utilized to treat ailments that are not related to animals alone. So again, to contend that, oh, you use ivermectin so you're crazy, that's a stupid argument. Ivermectin may not work for most people, but it could work for some.
Absolutely. There is, I mean, there's a real resistance to having a kind of an, what I'd call an open trial, which I was advocating for. And it's not just ivermectin. I mean, there are claims for other treatments, like I mentioned, you know, instead of hydroxychloroquine, you can have some other, what Dr. Zelenko calls the gun to put zinc in. You have budesonide, you have methylene blue. And in order to assess the claims, we do need large scale studies alongside a voluntary study on the vaccine so that, you know, if you think the vaccines is better for you, you go into that study, into that control group. Someone else goes into an ivermectin control group. Someone else goes into some other control group. And we would have millions in a variety of control groups. And of course, as an individual, you should have the choice to not go into any group or mix and match treatments. But if hundreds of millions are in these different studies, then you're going to get a lot of strong data 6 or 12 months down the track, which would benefit everyone. But it's a case of everything else being shut down as if treatments do not exist and they're impossible. And, you know, it certainly raises suspicion as to why it's being struck down because it, like you said, you know, ivermectin might well work for some people and maybe it doesn't work, but you know, why the suppression? Now, yes, there are some studies going on. There was one study that it was said that the data was fraudulent, but the author has contested that, and apparently the author of the study is not being heard. So
Okay, but Vinay, people are often critical of innovation. We tend to invest in what we know. And a couple of years ago, using mRNA technology to treat diseases was viewed as laughable.
well, it may well have progressed to the state where it isn't laughable. And it
Exactly.
does,
It's just
yeah,
the process
it's
of
fun.
innovation
Yeah,
and society. So
yeah.
today we may laugh at at some anti-COVID treatments, but next year they could become plausible. We don't know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, some of these products we spoke about, ivermectin was invented in the late 70s. Methylene blue has been around for more than 100 years and it's got some fantastic results in a particular town in India. So we don't know, but we need that to be out in the open. And that's just not the case. There's another very strange phenomenon. I don't know if you read about that I read in the South Korea Herald, also in the Times of India and elsewhere. There's a beautiful video by Dr. John Campbell. He's a British guy. He does a video on YouTube on this, and it's absolutely brilliant the way he makes you laugh as well as he discusses epistemology. And that video is about the way the injection for the vaccine is given, and if it isn't given properly in the muscle, if it hits a vein, then the possibility of large serious side effects. So we're not talking sore arm and few hours of fever or headache. We're talking something that's very debilitating, possibly for life or for a long term. Those effects are probably substantially reduced. And I have noticed that it's a very simple technique he demonstrates. Dr. Campbell demonstrates of aspiration. So they bring the needle back to make sure there's no blood being brought back, and then they insert it again on the upper deltoid area where it's least likely to hit a vein, but they have made sure that it isn't hitting a vein. And something as simple as that, if that massively reduces side effects, and it hasn't, this procedure apparently hasn't been followed exactly. And that's shocking. I mean, there are people who have died. Lisa Shaw, in the BBC radio presenter, died after her Astra dose. So this should be worldwide news. The news that when the virus broke out in Wuhan and an investigation as to how it happened should have been the focus worldwide. It wasn't. It was just brushed under the carpet. China just said no, no investigation. Take our word for it. It came from a bat. And then all the media organizations kind of like just repeated, yeah, it came from a bat.
But
So we're living in very strange times, actually.
Donald Trump is no longer the president, so people are willing to tolerate the assumption that the Chinese labs were operating below par and as a result the virus was leaked from a lab. People are now tolerating this belief because Donald Trump is not the president. But had Donald Trump been the president, we would not be hearing this story.
Yes, there is a political tinge to it because I understand the Biden administration actually did conclude that it's at least plausible, if not likely, that it came from the lab inadvertently or perhaps deliberately. But the bigger story is how was the lab funded, and our understanding currently is that in the Obama reign, in the Obama administration, Dr. Fauci was responsible for getting funding into a gain of control function. So this is astonishing. I mean, why on earth is there even this concept of a gain of function of what can end up as a deadly virus? And
The
there's
Epoch
no, yeah,
Times has been doing excellent reporting. Do you read the Epoch Times?
occasionally, yeah, I agree with you. They have been doing some excellent reporting. Also, Gatestone Institute does some, in my opinion, some very good
Yes.
reporting there. Yeah.
And no, on the issue of vaccines again. So, and like two academics, Germinal Van and this, I can't remember the co-author's name, but Germinal Van did a study, and a study was also done by a European medical journal arguing that vaccines do not slow the spread of COVID. The vaccine reduce the viral load. Therefore, if you take the vaccine, you're protecting yourself. This is a private issue, not a matter of public health, because the vaccines are not slowing the spread of COVID and neither do they prevent transmissions. So you decide if you're going to take the vaccine. It's a private matter. It's not a matter of public health.
I agree, absolutely. It isn't, especially because it's a leaky vaccine, as you said, and the leaky vaccines can cause more variants to come about from my understanding of the vaccines, the research that I've done is they do have some effect on, you acquiring COVID. But if you do acquire it and you're being fully vaccinated, then you are about as contagious as anyone else. So it doesn't affect other people. You are less likely to get hospitalized and you are much less likely to die. Now that message has been coming through very strong in a lot of studies and from virtually anyone and everyone who is actually treating COVID patients. So I'm prepared to believe that benefit, but against that benefit, there are some serious risks, some of which could be offset simply by administering the injection properly. And there is the biggest, more serious issue of prior COVID patients who are recovered being forced to take vaccines here in Australia and in the United States. There is an additional issue of not testing people who may have had a so mild and asymptomatic case of COVID that they didn't even know they had it until they tested. And they certainly probably wouldn't need the vaccine. So a lot of things that ought to happen aren't happening. And as you quite rightly said, if it was all voluntary and open and transparent, we would have a much better informed consent trial of the vaccines. And in all probability, they would probably benefit some people who need them.
Yes, and there's also the issue of children. Children are less likely to contract the vaccine and to transmit it. Several months ago, The Economist had an excellent feature on how children respond. Sorry, of how children responded to COVID. I said children are unlikely to contract the vaccine and so I kept saying vaccine. They're unlikely to contract COVID and to transmit it.
Yeah.
Yes, and The Economist magazine did a feature on the topic some months ago. So the children should return to school, and there's a prominent economist, Emily OSTR. I don't know if it's Oster, but she has compiled data, and Emily is arguing that the children can return to school and vaccine is not a necessity.
Well, in the initial data that came out of China, which is a very large scale study, the death rate among people below 20 was zero. And of children under 10 can't be less than zero. But I think that, if you weigh the risks and benefit here, the risk is virtually nil at this moment in time. I mean, you might get different variants that start affecting children, but there's virtually no risk for children. Yes, they could be carriers and they could transmit the disease potentially to their grandparents or parents, but you can't make them sacrificial lambs. You as an adult got to protect yourself with prophylactics, with fresh air, sunshine, vitamin C, vitamin D. There's a range of things you can do. Lose weight, get fit, all sorts of things you can do to counteract the likelihood of getting the virus that you ought to do, rather than sort of force the children in the society to take what might cause problems for them in the future. So, and on top of that, I don't know if all the data is being properly assimilated and properly discussed with parents. So clearly with a child, you don't have informed consent, but I don't believe even with the parents of those children being inoculated, you have a proper, free, informed consent. I mean, the FDA, I believe yesterday, or was it day before, have advised 5 to 11-year-olds in the United States to take the Pfizer jab. In India, I understand there's an entity called Covaxin that has already tested 2 to 6-year-olds. Moderna wants to test 2-year-olds. Sorry, they tested 6 to 10-year-olds, that Covaxin. Moderna and its partner in India want to test 2-year-olds. And there was a case against them that went to the Supreme Court, which said the parents simply haven't given informed consent. Covaxin has not even released the data on its trials. And certainly that means no informed consent. Also, they're recruiting poor people, possibly, they're getting paid. So we have something very dangerous going on at the
All right.
moment.
So Vinay, this is the last topic, and I'm going to be quite brief because I will be heading out soon. Facebook. It is being well, not promoted, but the mainstream media is reporting that Facebook is according privileges to some user. This is not the big story. The big story is the lady Francis, whatever her last name is, who said that Facebook is not doing enough to promote censorship. This essentially is her argument. She had a problem with misinformation. But Facebook, Vinay, is a platform facilitating free discourse and sometimes business information. Facebook is not a media entity. Do not compare Facebook to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Facebook is in the business of making money, and people like to entertain themselves. And when one particular person on Facebook is able to draw a large crowd, Facebook can use this data to gain money by selling ads. That's the business model of Facebook. Facebook is not a news entity. And this is the issue. People want to treat Facebook like it is a news entity. It is not. So I don't care if people promote fake news on Facebook. It is not the job of the engineers on Facebook to promote accuracy in reporting. That's not their job.
I agree, but I mean, there's a range of things wrong with that. Firstly, Facebook hasn't been anything like a neutral platform for
Yeah,
several
it
years
isn't
now.
neutral.
And this whistleblowing, I believe, was an establishment set up because they're targeting things that are not. The fundamental problem here is that the censorship, the so-called fact checking. I mean, I can't say the fact checkers are uh, bootlicking servants of the establishment. So it's not fact check. I mean, you can't have somebody sitting on judgment who says this is truth and this isn't. We have to have free debate on things. We have to have free speech. And if Facebook censors, then it does become a media entity, which was Donald Trump's essential argument, which I
Yeah,
agree with.
but yeah, I agree with your point on the censorship, but I object to treating Facebook like a serious news reporting entity. The business model of Facebook is really advertising and making money. It's a platform, and people can promote whatever they wish. You up to consume it. You don't have to get your news from Facebook. People choose to get their news from Facebook because they're lazy.
Yeah, Facebook has, I mean, you could argue Facebook is a private organization, although its origins have been in the CIA funding of it. And a lot of the social media is still tied in with contracts from the defense, Department of Defense and such. So they do have ties to the government. I mean, I just read a piece on Gatestone Institute which said Zuckerberg financed hundreds of millions, of dollars he put into different election centers for the 2020 presidential election to make sure or to aid Biden in key counties. So the problem we've got is these so-called private corporations have already been co-opted in that large deep state incestuous setup. So we're not ever going to get a neutral Facebook now, ever. I don't think so.
I don't want Facebook to be neutral. To be honest, I have little interest in social media. But Vinny, I'm enjoying this conversation, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. So bye.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Thank you
All
very
right then.
much.
Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye for now.